Hello, Augies Worldwide. I'm Dave Casler, amateur radio call sign KE0OG, and we are going to answer a question today about upper sideband versus lower sideband. This comes from Elmar KN4RZO. Okay, now he has an interesting question. He's noticed that the general rule is that for all bands below 10 megahertz, we use lower sideband and upper sideband on the upper bands, except, now we're getting into a lot of exceptions here, okay, except on 60 meters, which is by government mandate upper sideband. Government and also almost all commercial radio services will use upper sideband. If you go back and look at the original single sideband work that Bell Labs did to make their transcontinental network work, what they did is they take a group, which was 12 telephone channels, and they would multiplex them together, one starting at 0, the next starting at 3 kilohertz, the next starting at 6 kilohertz, and so on, all the way up, and then they'd put a pilot carrier. What that pilot carrier did is it allowed the phase information to be recovered, so the voices sounded relatively natural. By the way, just for interest's sake, the telephone bandwidth for local service is 4 kilohertz, but for long distance service is 3 kilohertz. Now, that has kind of come over into our way of doing single sideband because that was the way single sideband was back in the 50s when it was first developed. Now, the reason for upper and lower sideband is because the local oscillator put a frequency out. Let's say it was 10 megahertz, okay? So what you had to do was take the signal from 7 megahertz, beat it against the signal at 10 megahertz, and then take the difference frequency, and that was what went into the IF. Well, if you take the difference, the minus 7 megahertz, okay, that would flip the signal. So the lower sideband became the upper sideband and so on. And so for that to work, lower sideband was adopted on 40 and 80 meters, also 160, because the way the radio was constructed, they took the difference for the 7 megahertz and the 3.5 megahertz, and in doing so, it just inverted it. So what came upright through the IF filter was lower sideband, but if you went to a higher band, like 14 megahertz, 20 meters, then what would happen then is that they took the difference, but the difference was positive, because 14 is higher than 10, and so you kept the upper sideband in there. So if you put together a receiver like that, just automatically it works out best to use lower sideband on 80, 40, 160 meters, and upper sideband on 20 meters on up through 10 meters, and all work that's done at VHF using single sideband, which yes, you can do if you have the right radio, it's always upper sideband. So let's just sort of take a look at that because some things have changed. Okay, this right here is a transmitter from the mid-1970s, so it's about 50 years old. Okay, and it has tube, driver, and final. The rest is transistor. So you had to tune the plate, tune the loading, and the pre-selector, and there was a process you went through to get this loaded. But note down here on the mode, you had lower sideband and upper sideband. It does not automatically choose for you. So lower sideband when you're on 40 meters or 80, and upper sideband when you're on 20 and above, okay? So you had to know which one to tune it to, and if you forgot, you were on 20 meters on upper sideband, and you went to 40 meters and forgot to do that, every signal sounded like it was Donald Duck, okay? So you learn quickly where to put that on that. So that's how the older radios were. By the time you get into around the year 2000, so 25 years ago, this radio right here does that for you. It knows by which band that you choose in there, whether it's upper sideband, lower sideband. Okay, this radio right here, which is more 2015-ish, okay, so 10 years old, this also will do the upper and lower sideband automatically, as all the modern radios do, including the ICOM 7300, which will do upper and lower sideband automatically. Well, let's take a look at single sideband just a little bit. Going the direction of frequency, 0 is somewhere over here, but you've got a carrier frequency. This is the dial frequency in amateur radio. This is the dial frequency right there, but you're transmitting either above it or below it. Okay, now in government, commercial, and so on, the frequency of the dial, if you're doing upper sideband, for example, the frequency of the dial is the midpoint. This is why on 60 meters, they give us the center point on that, and we have to tune 1.5 kilohertz low. All right. Now, it was quickly learned that the carrier was just there. Now, it did provide something. It provided the phase relationships. And you didn't need both sidebands because they contained identical information, except they were mirrored upside down. So, for example, 300 kilohertz right there. I'm sorry, 300 hertz. And here is 300 hertz. So these two are mirror images. Here's 3 kilohertz, which is the upper, and here is 3 kilohertz. You had the identical information in each sideband, and so why transmit both? Why not put all your power into this? This gives you about an 8 dB gain over AM. And you can see why people were excited about this back when this was first coming to the fore in the late 30s, and of course, you know, well on into the 50s before it really became established in ham radio. Now, I told you about how that old radio plan where you have 10 megahertz local oscillator, okay, and you would feed the incoming signal into a mixer, and here's 7 megahertz, okay, and so you had a mixer, so you get the sum, the difference, plus the two originals. What we're looking for is a difference, 10 minus 7. That means that for a frequency to be higher, it had to go beyond this, okay? And so it was the lower sideband that was the easiest way to do it. If people transmitted in lower sideband, you'd pick that up. But if you were up here, say at 20 meters, you would get, this is at 14, you'd get 10 plus 14, which is 24. And that would be the frequency you feed into the IF, okay? And this adds 7150 kilohertz. Okay, in order to get that far down, you had to come past it over here in order to get a difference that was this, all right? So that's kind of how it developed for historical reasons. Hams are kind of the only people who use lower sideband. I know it's used on CB too. One of the nice things about it on CB, if you've got a channel here that's AM and you put single sideband, you're only using one side of it. Someone else can do upper sideband and you basically double the number of channels because the carrier goes away, of course. I can remember when CB was all AM, and in the afternoon the skip would come in and you'd hear all these carriers competing with each other. It was a mess. Okay, so we've got these bands, 160, 80, 40. We're going to jump from here to 30. 30 has no voice on it. This is actually a 10 megahertz band. Okay, then we've got 20, 17, and 15, and 12 and 10. So these are upper sideband for SSB. These are lower sideband for SSB. Now, there's nothing in the rules that says you have to use it, but it certainly is amateur best practice to use this. Now, the 31, there's no voice. Okay, so that's how it works on single sideband. Also, if you go up from here into the 6 meter, 2 meter, 70 centimeter, there's a 1.25 meter in here also. It's all upper sideband. Okay, so that's where it came from, and that is how it is used today. Now, you're also asking for conventions for digital. Well, that depends, okay? A lot of the initial, this has to do with radio teletype, okay? Radio teletype has two tones, a mark and a space. The way these were traditionally transmitted, the radio had a little frequency shift keyer in here. When you got a 1 from the terminal unit, it would put out this, and a 0 would put out this, and so on. Anyway, but it is traditional to send these this side on lower sideband, okay? Forever, it's been that way, lower sideband. If you're doing actual RTTY using direct FSK. Now again, this is the dial frequency, and these are in the 2 kilohertz range. These tones are really high pitched. Okay, now there's sort of a reason for that. If you put it down here, any nonlinearity in the receiver will create an image out over here. You don't want it to be a harmonic, okay? Pure FSK, direct FSK, works this way on lower sideband, and it sorts out where they're supposed to be. Now, let's talk about the greater emphasis on digital. Okay, digital in our case, we're going to be talking about everything from packet. Yes, there is HF on packet. I once read an article about packet radio and how wonderful it was on HF, and that turned out to be completely incorrect. Packet is terrible on HF. The reason is this, because the bit error rate on HF is about 1 bit error every 100 bits on average. Well, a packet in packet radio has to be sent perfectly and can be 200 or 300 bits in the message. So you are more likely than not to have an error. That didn't last very long. Then they came up with something called AMTOR, which was sent audio frequency shift keying. And would go back and forth between two. But it had a very weird structure. It would send 3 characters, 3 bytes. These were each bytes. And then it would tack onto that 3 parity bits. So you'd actually transmit this, and then you'd listen for the receiver, and the receiver would either send an acknowledgement, it got it correctly, or a not acknowledgement, a NAC. Okay, and then you'd send this again. Now, the switching here was extremely fast, and you had to have a radio that could switch from transmit to receive in just a few milliseconds. A lot of radios can't do that. But my old Yaesu FT747 did do it. Okay, and I did a lot of AMTOR. Now, AMTOR, which would beat the living daylights out of the relays in your radio, because every 3 letters it would switch to receive and so on. It made quite the racket when it transmitted, but it was nearly error-free. If you had any signal at all, it would be error-free. Then came along something called PSK. PSK31, which can only be sent by creating an audio signal for it. PSK31 has very narrow bandwidth. So there was like from 7070 to 7073, which is one voice channel. But this is, you'll note that these are in the CW portion of the band. Because these were so narrow, you could fit dozens of these signals into that bandwidth, and you pick one you were listening to. In fact, a lot of the software got so good that it didn't just decode the one you're interested in. It would decode all of them. And you could take your pick, and the ones that we're calling CQ would be picked for you. This has no error correction. No error correction. However, this is a phase-shifted mode, okay? Phase-shifted. And so your transmitter and receiver had to be highly linear so you didn't create a problem. So it became normal for people to transmit about 25 watts instead of 100. They turned their transmitters down, so you got very, very, very linear on this thing. I made hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of PSK31. Now, I'm going to say and associated modes. They start about 7070, 14070, and so on. About 70 kilohertz up from the edge of the band. And this would be your PSK. And then many of you know the frequency 7074, which was right here. There's a little bit of a guard band. And this would be FT8. Now, FT8 has a choice of 8 tones, whereas RTTY only has the 2. This gives you better error. Plus, the FT8 code is designed for really poor HF communications channel to be able to get stuff through. Okay, it doesn't use ACK and NAC. It's all forward error correction, FEC, forward error correction. You had enough information here that you could decode most errors. Okay? Now, PSK31 was sent in upper sideband. Okay? By convention of the inventors of the mode. They put it in upper sideband. I remember reading the very first article in QST on this. They had to get their signal exactly tuned in right. But then a piece of software called Digipan, which is no longer maintained, didn't need to know what frequency that was. It decoded all of the signals in here at once. This is no longer kept current, and you need, in order to use it, you've got to have RS-232 coming out of your computer, and computers don't come with RS-232 anymore. You can still get it. In fact, Microsoft removed support for RS-232 at one point, and oh, the feedback was instantaneous, because there's a lot of medical equipment, SCADA equipment, and so on that uses RS-232. So they had to put support for it back in, and in order to get RS-232 in a computer, you need to buy a card that will do that. I have a little card downstairs that'll give me 2 of those, but I don't need them for anything. Okay, so then there were things like MFSK, that's an M, believe it or not. There came out several other modes, Olivia, and so on. There were lots of different modes. But then out came the 3rd generation of digital, which was JT65. JT65, okay? And I did a lot of JT65. It would take 1 minute per round. The other guy would transmit for a minute. You would transmit for a minute. So it was slow. You had to have a lot of patience. The same guy, Joe Taylor, came out with FT8. This is another guy. Can't remember his name. The T is for Taylor, and it's 8 separate frequencies. that the thing will bounce between, like that, to make a signal. And these are very close together, so you need a lot of FT8 signals. The band used for it now starts at the band edge. 7074 is this right here, and it uses upper sideband, okay? Because all the other digital modes, except for RTTY, used upper sideband. So this is just an extension of the use for it. You used to have a sound card that makes your tones, receives your tones. A sound card is not just something that makes noise. It's a very sophisticated audio signal processor, and it can create tones, any tone, if you tell it what to create. Okay, so these are all upper sideband. If you're doing a RTTY, let's see, you want voice, 80, 40 are lower sideband. 60 by government decree is upper sideband, which is confusing to people. Very few people use this, but now they've recently expanded our frequency privileges in there, so you can actually talk to people. Okay, so for digital is almost always upper sideband. Okay, for RTTY, traditional RTTY is lower sideband. However, a lot of the pieces of digital software, like FLDigi, which will do all those different modes, including RTTY, is upper sideband. Now, that you've got the two carriers. If these get flipped, you're upside down. But the software will take care of that. So when you're using something like FLDigi for RTTY, you're using upper sideband on your transmitter, and it'll switch those back to the right ones. Now, slow scan television is a voice mode. It is legal. This is referred to in the FCC documents as image. Okay, slow scan television is a misnomer. The only thing about it is that you're scanning a picture. It's more like fax than television. You send one picture at a time. And this follows whatever the voice pattern is. There are specific frequencies television is done on. This is something you might want to print out and keep in your shack. The Considerate Operator's Frequency Guide. This is arrl.org/files/file, singular, /conop, CONOP.pdf. Now, you'll note here your SSTV has got different calling frequencies. This one is digital, this is analog, okay? This shows you where the calling frequencies are for things. They got RTTY data and stuff in here, and by that data they mean things like FT8 and so on. Okay, they don't tell you which sideband, because the ones that are on the voice frequencies, like slow scan television, follow the same format as voice. So on these lower bands, they would be lower sideband. The upper bands, they would be upper sideband, except of course on 60 meters. So there you have it. This, I think, is the answer to Elmar's question that talks about lower sideband or upper sideband and where they're used and so on. So until we next meet, 73.